Hello, everyone. We began last week's session with three anecdotes, with three different ways of understanding Zionism or tellings of the Zionist story, the Messianic idea. For David Ben-Gurion, a Zionist or the beginning of Zionism is simply an individual that foresees a future in which Jews take the state for themselves, take the land of Israel, instill sovereignty for themselves. For Nachum Sokolov, we saw that it can be indirect to trying to come back to Israel, but it requires political, diplomatic action, and this for him was his first Zionist, Menashe ben Israel. And for Rav Kook said, "Your Zionists are my messiahs." So we have here this constant confluence, and this led us up to the story of David el-Roi, where we saw this as someone that he could fit into any play. You could write a play about him being a first Zionist, you could write a play about him being one of the most famous false messiahs, and you could question both narratives. We're talking here about narratives, about stories of how to understand Zionism, Messianism, and the connection between the two. And as I touched upon last time, we're talking about the Kabbalistic birth pangs, which I very delicately touched upon, and today we're going to get more into it. Don Isaac Abarbanel, without a doubt, is where one version of the story should begin. It was Professor Ben-Zion Netanyahu, the father of Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, who writes a dissertation on Don Isaac Abarbanel, and later what becomes a very important monograph, both about the life of Abravanel and the thought of Abravanel. By the way, the reason I say Abravanel is because Netanyahu in his work says, some say Abravanel, some say Abarbanel. He paskins, he says the way you should say it is Abravanel. So I go with Netanyahu. You can go with whoever you please. If the Messianic idea, until the medieval era, until the time of Abravanel, even during the time of Maimonides and Nachmanides, if you're a Jew and the Messianic idea is a Broadway play, it's a Broadway play everyone's raving about, but you've only heard snippets. You've heard some, because no one wants to, it's almost like no one wants to ruin the whole story, so you don't know much. You know the scene where there's a Messiah, son of Joseph, that attempts something and dies. And you know of this idea that you're not supposed to do something. And you have conflicting and contradictory ideas, and you don't know much. And you have scattered prophecies and works. And we might hear of the importance of the connection of the 10 tribes, the lost tribes, and the Sambatyon River, and all sorts of elements. But if the Messianic idea is a play, make no mistake, Don Isaac Abarbanel is the playwright. He, in the we're talking late 15th century, writes this, he becomes the playwright. And the setting for this play is the Spanish expulsion, is being expelled from Portugal. Who was Don Isaac Abarbanel? Don Isaac Abarbanel was a court Jew, part of a famous, prominent family who generation after generation had served as finances of the kings and queens of Portugal, but it didn't help, because eventually they're kicked out. And then also when we're at the verge, the brink of the Spanish expulsion, and Abravanel's already in Spain after he's left. He's had to leave all of his possessions in Portugal, even though he did nothing wrong. As the most powerful, potentially powerful representative of the Jewish people, he will try and advocate, telling the king and queen, we don't have to do this. Nobody listens. And he has to head to Italy towards the end of the 15th century. The fuel that leads this thinker to write the Messianic play, the Abravanelian Messianic play, with a clear Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3, is the Spanish expulsion. It's being expelled out of Portugal. It's the Inquisition. And interestingly, Ben-Zion Netanyahu notices that when we talk about Abravanel's Messianic idea, there can be no one that is more important. No one has written before his time and potentially after his time more about Messianic literature. He's the one that creates the Messianic bibliography. Right? We all know you want to study a topic, you compile a bibliography. one could view Abravanel as compiling the first bibliography on the Messianic idea. And this idea, as Ben-Zion Netanyahu notices, is influenced heavily by Kabbalah and what he calls mysticism. And as we will see, what this means is that for Abravanel, the Messianic idea unfolds throughout history. And that is to say that history is the unfolding of the divine. In one of Abravanel's works, he tells us something very interesting. He says to us, in his first work, which is a commentary on Daniel. The book of Daniel is important because this is where Abravanel is going to write Wells of Hope. This is where Abravanel is going to tell us how history is going to pan out, when Messiah is going to come. And what's interesting in this work is that Abravanel will tell us, astrology works. You need astrology in order to understand when certain windows of opportunity or problematic moments happen in history. Notice the difference between Maimonides that will say, astronomy, yes, astrology, no way. But Kabbalists, since the time of Nachmanides, make astrology kosher because it's very simple. And they come up with an idea that Abravanel fully adopts in his historic, or the way he perceives history. The explicit influence, what makes things explicitly happen, Nachmanides already tells us this. Professor Dov Schwartz, an expert on the medieval era, on Zionism, on the Maharal, on many topics from Bar Ilan University, notices that for Nachmanides, the explicit manifestation of history is astrology. The astral plane is what influences history explicitly, according to Nachmanides. But what drives the astral plane, what influences the astral plane, is the divine Godhead. And this is why if we have these 10 sfirot, we have the three top ones, Keter, Chochma, Bina, wisdom, knowledge, and the supernal crown. This is usually the head of the Godhead that we can't touch. It's beyond time, beyond everything. Then the lowest 7 spheres is where we have an aspect of the manifestation or emanation of the Godhead, which already relates to what we see in the world. And so we have 7 planets coinciding with the 7 lowest spheres. And the 7 planets, the astral plane gets its energy. The way the sun and the moon move and what dictates their movement is influenced by certain sphirot, by certain elements within the Godhead. And this idea is fully adopted by Don Isaac Abarbanel. And so in this sense, Ben-Zion Netanyahu already noticed he wasn't a Kabbalist, but he's very much influenced, and he says he's very much influenced by Kabbalistic thinking. When we talk about this trilogy, we're talking only about 2 years. It's after Abravanel has had to leave, right? This important figure has to leave, almost in the middle of the night, leave Portugal, no possessions, and then leave Spain after the expulsion, and ends up in Italy, Naples and Sicily. It's between the years 1497 and 1499, just 2 years, where the Jewish people in the region have almost utterly lost hope. Why have they lost hope? Because what came before, or part and parcel with the Inquisition and with the expulsion, is Christian theologians convincing Jews the Jewish Messianic idea is irrelevant. Jews are historically insignificant. Why? Because Jesus was the Messiah, he's going to come back, and all of your prophecies, no matter who you bring, all dealt with the Second Temple era. And you lost your chance because you misbehaved. So, come be good Christians. This is the geopolitical climate. This is the talk in synagogue, or lack thereof, in the time of Abravanel. Jews have lost hope. A majority of Jews have lost hope. And so one could argue that the first thing Abravanel needs to do is instill hope. And this he does. If there are 2 important aspects in which we can view the Abravanelian Messianic play, one is it reinstills hope amongst Jews that Messiah is still going to come big time. So instilling hope. It's not enough for Abravanel to instill hope. He also constantly will bash the Christian arguments and disprove anything that counters the Jewish Messianic idea. So, for example, he will address the issue of the Antichrist, and in one of his works he'll say, have you ever thought why is it that the Antichrist is such a fundamental tenet in Christianity? Because the sages, because the fathers of Christianity learnt from the prophets and the sages about Messiah, son of Joseph. And they were so afraid that when Messiah, son of Joseph comes, Christians are going to pack up shop and leave, that they invented the Antichrist. So he's at this perfect position in terms of his background and growing up as a court Jew to get a good yeshiva background education as well as a scientific background, and he is the person to write the Messianic trilogy. No one else but Abravanel could do this. And so one goal of the Messianic trilogy is to reinstill hope amongst Jews. Od lo avda tikvatenu. It's not too late, it can still happen. The second important part is, how's it going to happen? How's it going to pan out? We don't know what's going to happen. We all still think, because Maimonides and Nachmanides' attempts didn't have enough of a stronghold, we still don't know if maybe the passive Messianic model is the one we need to go with, and if it's active, how does it happen? And Abravanel, in true Abravanelian form, gives you order. There's Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. And in 3 of his works, he addresses complementing issues. So, for example, in Mayane Yeshua, in Wells of Hope, his pioneering Messianic work, it's to show how history pans out and that history is the unfolding of the divine and how the Messianic idea is going to unfold. And make no mistake, as part of this unfolding, there are active steps that we have to take upon ourselves. Albeit, and here I must be careful, scholars of Abravanel, we can talk about at times vague and contradicting ideas that we're not really sure what to do with. But then again, when was the last time you went to a Broadway play that you, amongst yourselves, debated, did this scene mean this, did this scene mean that? And Abravanel is no different. And we're going to see when things need to be carefully curated, and these drop mic moments have to be very delicately achieved because of what the majority of Jews think. Abravanel knows how to do this as a seasoned politician and diplomat. And then we shift on to Yeshuot Meshicho, to the redemptions of his Redeemer or hopes of his Redeemer, where he wants to compile all of the different bits in the Talmud, where, what Ephraim Urbach said, it's multifaceted, it's contradictory. Abravanel is going to say, I'm going to bring it all together. And he compiles there the bibliography of the Talmud and other sources to understand what this is going to look like and what we know, how it's going to pan out. And then what Netanyahu considered to be his magnum opus, his final work, Mashmiya Yeshua, the heralder of hope. Here Abravanel goes prophecy by prophecy. From Bilam, the first foreseer, the first one to prophesize a hope of a redeemer, from Bilam, the evil, the sorcerer, whatever you want to call him, through Moses to the prophets, complementing his work on Daniel and the Talmud, he is going to show us all of the different prophecies and to prove that they have nothing to do with the Second Temple. They could not possibly have anything to do with the Second Temple. For example, a classic move by Abravanel, a depiction of Isaiah that when the Messiah comes, you're going to have sheep living with lamb, you're going to have this supernatural element, and he says, I don't recall that happening at the Second Temple era, so it simply hasn't happened yet. And it really is a majestic play. Let's focus now on Mashmiya Yeshua, on the heralder of hope. Let's look at the very introduction to understand how bad the situation is at the time of that Abravanel is writing and why it is so important. Grab for us a Moabite and an Ammonite foxes that spoke against the Lord and his Messiah. Right? Someone that understands structure and the importance of the first sentence. There are enemies, and our enemies misunderstand and are talking against the Lord and the Messiah. And now, what we're curious about is, who are these enemies? And I'm going to share let you in on a little secret. It's not the Christians. Things that are not so, those who contextualize and scheme cunningly from every biblical prophetic passage. For when they saw within the prophecies many destined troubles and harm upon the Israelites, and that Judah was exiled, they said, these are miserable Jews. This is this Jew becoming of historical insignificance. They said, these are miserable Jews. And I saw wise ones in our people who go by the path of God and safeguard his covenant. Right? I've seen Jews that still, even though they're not allowed to, are getting circumcised, who take the prophecies in two paths. So we have kosher Jews, according to Abravanel, that have that part ways when it comes to interpreting the depictions of Messiah. One I call the cultivators, the good guys, and one I call the destroyers, the bad guys. For the first ones interpreted the prophecies literally and truthfully, as I, Abravanel, am going to do, by way of what has occurred and what has yet to occur, that a sage will blossom like a date, and this is the sect that has faith in our Lord. But the problem is, this is a minority. However, from the lion's den and the mountain haunts of leopards, right? Notice the poetic flair in Abravanel's writing. He will weave in prophetic verses to make the most clear and passionate of arguments. From holy seed came upon Mount Zion those named foxes that we opened with, wise folk in their own eyes. And while they were among the Jewish people and circumcised, they rebelled against the light and shepherded the foolish by saying that the destinies of the prophecies in the book of Psalms were said and have already occurred during the time of the Second Temple. This is the Messianic pickle. This is the problem. Jews in shul getting an aliyah and are preaching. Imagine you go to shul on Sabbath, right? We need to bring this into contemporary times. You go to shul on Sabbath, doesn't matter where on earth your synagogue is, it could be Monte Carlo, Melbourne, or Jerusalem. And your local rabbi suddenly says, the state of Israel, Zionism, it just doesn't work with what the Gospels teach us. We really need to be reading more about Jesus. This is what is happening at the time of Abravanel. He's saying prominent rabbis, circumcised Jews, people with power, they think they're shepherds, and they're saying it's a lost cause. Christians have convinced them. And that the principle of faith in the coming of our Messiah is not according to the sources, but rather a tradition of the Rishonim. Those same rabbis are telling you the Messianic idea, it's a medieval invention, an invention of the Middle Ages. It's not ancient. And they wrote this about a book disgracefully. These men were small, misguiding foxes. And what wisdom have they to shepherd with the secret gardens of prophecy? Notice the nuanced way in which he weaves in, one needs secrets. One needs Kabbalah in order to understand how to read the Messianic teachings. One could argue that, and many have written about the Messianic idea. What is so Jewish about the Messianic idea? And one could argue whether we look at the Maimonidean view, the Nachmanidean view, it doesn't matter if you're, where you stand, it instills hope. It is from the people that brought you, yeh beseder, it'll be okay. And this is of the utmost importance. And Abravanel identifies that in his time and age, there is no more hope. One of the ways in which, before we continue, one of the ways in which Ben Zion Netanyahu concludes his monograph on Abravanel is by noticing the paradoxical behavior. A statesman, someone who I would have thought at times of trouble would have tried to instill Jewish sovereignty, would have tried to gather the Jewish people and come back to the land. But one could argue that Abravanel noticed, as a seasoned politician and diplomat, we're not there yet. It's not possible. Do you want to know what action needs to be taken? First, instilling hope. Second, how it's going to pan out. And in this respect, I want us to go back and think about Ben Gurion's depiction of a first Zionist, Sokolov's, and the Rav Kook's, and keep that in mind as we continue on to understand the systematic Messianic play that Abravanel gives us. Because what we're going to look at now, if we understand the purpose of the Messianic play, to instill hope, the next stage is to explain to Jews how you're going to instill sovereignty. And what we're all curious to know is this Messianic idea a passive one or an active one? Make no mistake, it is an active one, albeit it is subtle. It is very subtle. So, but how, and this also is in Mayane Yeshua, in Wells of Hope. But how will this happen? Will the Ishmaelites invade the lands of Christians? I have pondered this for many days, and now I will tell you what I believe. Right? This is our thinker, inspired by Kabbalistic thinking, understanding that certain current events, the fall of Constantinople, is not just a historic event, but it is a divine fingerprint, a divine pointing of the finger saying, no, do you see the sign? Something's got to happen. It is that God, may he be exalted, will place in the hearts of the nations of Edom, the Christians, the desire to pass through and conquer the land of Ishmael, Muslims, or the Ottoman Empire, particularly the land of Israel, because they all long for that land as the site of the burial of their deity, right, of Jesus. What is Abravanel telling us here? If we try and understand the key elements, what has been scattered until the time of Abravanel, and Abravanel will tell you it's Act 1, 2, and 3. Abravanel makes it very clear. Act 1, Gog uMagog. There is going to be what looks like a historic war between Christendom and Islam. And we know the reasons for this, right? Because the Ottomans have conquered Constantinople, they're in Israel, but that's where Jesus is buried, and we know the rest of this. So there's going to be, and he identifies in his days, tension. He notices the Christians can take on them and beat them. He's seen Christian soldiers, he's seen Muslim soldiers, he says, I'm backing the Christians. And he notices so this is the first element, the historic element you have to watch out for. A war, waging war between Christendom and Islam. Act 2. Since most of the lands that are today under the control of the Turk, the king of Egypt, Antioch, Jerusalem, and all of the land of Israel were initially in the hands of the descendants of Edom, Christians, and were later seized by the Ishmaelites, by the Muslims, they, the nations of Edom, the Christians, will arise to reclaim them. Especially when they see, so far we have Act 1, now we've in Act 2. Especially when they see the Jews gathered and appointing a leader for themselves, notice, instigating action, choosing a leader. I'll let you guess who this leader is. Their anger will be kindled of the nations, and they will be confident, and they will confidently invade these lands and conquer them. So we're talking here about a joint pact between Christians and Jews coming, choosing a leader and fighting against Muslims. They will inflict upon the Ishmaelites sword wounds, slaughter, and destruction. The second act tells us that Jews have to do something. They have to get into military action, which reminds us of the Maimonidean King Messiah. It reminds us of Bar Kokhba. It instills hope that Bar Kokhba could have happened, could have been, but didn't, and that's fine. Let's now see who this figure is. And here we must stress something. This is, to the best of my mind, the only instance in which Abravanel will clearly say, or there's one other place where he refers to this instance, where the Jews are going to gather and choose, bottom up, who this leader is. So the assumption is someone like David el-Roi could come along, he'll fit the criteria, and the Jews will decide together. Notice that the gathering also implies one of Abravanel's favorite ideas, the coming back of the 10 tribes. Now, why is the coming back of the 10 tribes so important? In brackets. It's part of the way Christians convince Jews that you're historically insignificant. You really think you're going to be able to get up and rise and fight? You're barely a tribe left. Abravanel is well aware, as a realist, that the numbers, demography, is not the Jewish strong point. But once prophecies tell us that the 10 tribes are going to come back, this is a critical mass. This is a military. So the Jews are going to gather together, implying in the second act the 10 tribes are going to come together. And Jews collectively are going to choose This figure that's going to lead them in a military campaign as part of the Christian war against Muslims. Then the Ishmaelites will gather and wage war against them in Jerusalem, where the seats of all their rulers will be, and they will kill them and destroy them. In this manner, the downfall of Edom and Ishmael, both Christians and Muslims will fall, will unfold together, and through this the Messiah will be revealed. Our sages of blessed memory received the tradition. So wait, first notice that if you want the Messiah to be revealed, the Jews must gather, which is a natural process, and choose a leader who's going to wage war, a military campaign. And then, our sages of blessed memory received the tradition, and initially, Messiah, son of Ephraim, aka son of Joseph, we'll get to that perhaps, will be revealed and will fight against the nations that come to Jerusalem. He will be killed in the battle, and after him, Messiah, son of David, will arise. For Abravanel, unlike Maimonides, and potentially also Nachmanides, Abravanel makes it very clear in his play we have a two-stage process. We have Messiah, son of Joseph, which is a natural process. This is a human being that is going to die in war, and this implies, like Bar Kokhba, his role is to be a military campaigner. And this is the first Messiah. One of the interesting things in the series is we're going to see how this character, Messiah, son of Joseph, evolves between our figures. From those that view him as a military campaigner, to those that view him as the chairman of the Jewish agency, to those that actually view him as Herzl. But what we have here, Abravanel says, is stage one is Messiah, son of Joseph. It is necessity for this process to happen, and it's natural. And it requires the Jewish people to act. This will lead to Messiah, son of Joseph, to David, that Abravanel then reveals is a more supernatural, this is not going with Maimonides, it's going more with Nachmanides and with our Kabbalists, it's more supernatural, the happily ever after, that is, kind of magical. Okay. What we see here, before we move on to the next stage, is the conclusion. We're going to now close curtain on the first and last Messianic play. It has three clear acts where we have waging war or instigating war between Christendom and Islam. We have the gathering of the 10 tribes, choosing a leader. And as I mentioned, Abravanel, I don't think it's accidental that this diplomat, politician, seasoned, chooses only to mention this once or twice, like grains of salt. He's very careful because he's aware of the problems this might cause. Perhaps he's even afraid of what he's writing. He's being so explicit. And then they're going to wage war, and this will then instigate the next process and the happily ever after. We now close curtain on Abravanel, who dies 1508, and not 15 years pass, and we have two figures, the secretary or legal advisor to King João, the King of Portugal, and an enigmatic, charismatic, mysterious individual by the name of David Reubeni, that this sort of dynamic duo that much like Messianism and Zionism are magnetically pulled together, and yet they could not be pushed further away. It's almost as if Diego Pires, who we're going to learn in a moment, turns to become the Kabbalah Shlomo Molkho, and David Reubeni are the manifestation, are the historic emphasis on the sticky and meshed relationship between the Messianic idea and Zionism. And for this we have to shift now to around 1521, 22, 23. We're going to meet a figure by the name of David Reubeni. Who is David Reubeni? We have no idea. The story goes as follows. We have one manuscript. It used to be sitting in the Bodleian in Oxford, Bodleian Library, and there we have written in Hebrew, medieval Hebrew, perhaps an autograph version, David Reubeni writes a diary in Hebrew, essentially about a figure that tries to play out the Abravanelian Messianic play. He tries to create, as we will see, wage war between Christendom and Islam, and tries to instigate a process where the Jews are going to come back, 10 tribes, yada, yada, yada. Let's read the beginning of what is now a lost manuscript. In the mid-19th century, the surviving manuscript was copied by facsimile. So we have a copy, and just as mysterious as Davida Reubeni, the manuscript has mysteriously disappeared. How does this diary begin? I am David, the son of King Solomon of blessed memory. My older brother is King Joseph, who from his throne in the desert of Chavor ruled over the 30 myriads, over the tribes of Gad, Reuven, and half the tribe of Menashe. It's as if this guy is literally writing, editing the Abravanel Messianic play. What is he dangling? The 10 tribes, the lost tribes are coming together. A Jew, right, he's on cue. We don't know, did he read Abravanel, not read Abravanel? The resemblance is uncanny. So he begins by saying, my name's David, and I'm the son of a King Solomon in the early 16th century. I'm from somewhere in Saudi Arabia, because we know he gets to Jeddah and then to Gaza and to Jerusalem. And this is the government of the 2.5 lost tribes. So if you're a Jew and you've now read Abravanel, just 15 years have passed, and you've read Abravanel, and you're thinking, wow, this is what he spoke about. This is amazing. This is happening. I left my brother and the king and his advisors, the 70 elders, charged to go immediately to procure an audience with his grace the Pope. So I left them setting out for the desert on the mountainous route. In 10 days I reached Jeddah, and so on and so forth. What is a diary that blends in very personal moments at which Davida Reubeni is despair. There are comic moments. He has a servant that he always gets upset with and always gets him in trouble, and he's always bickering about this servant of what problems he causes for him. Davida Reubeni is a man on a mission. Conveniently, by the time he reaches Rome to meet the Pope, he's lost all of his money, but he looks and acts like a regal, like someone that comes from royalty. Jews are skeptical in Rome, some are more skeptical, some are less. In Venice, he gets a meeting with the Pope. And he convinces the Pope to give him a letter. So he tries to convince the Pope to reconciliate between the different Christian empires, come together and wage war together with his brother's kingdom, because they're very strong warriors, but they lack gunpowder and things that Europeans have. Let's come together, Christians and Jews, and fight against the Muslims. Let's take back what is ours. Right? Good idea. The Pope at the time, not the strongest of characters. It's sensitive, a lot of things going on. And there are Jews that are whispering into the Pope's ear, how can you believe this person? And yet, if you're living in this day and age, it might pay off to believe what someone like this tells you. So the Pope listens and then decides, look, I'm not your guy. But King João, Portugal, he's got business in the Middle East, he's the person you should go to. At this point, Davida Reubeni has a fleet or an entourage, as Alan Verskin and others, and Zev Aronashkoli had written prior about, a professor that dealt with many different topics in Jewish history, one of them, the Messianic idea. His entourage reaches the shores of Portugal, and he has a banner, right? He has a flag given to him by Benvenista, but by a daughter from a granddaughter of Abravanel. And it's this beautiful banner, this sign of sovereignty and independence with Hebrew lettering on it, that he carries proudly. He speaks proud Hebrew. He's a proud Jew. He reaches Portugal. Jews are kissing his hand. Jews are starting to call him Messiah. He meets the king. He gets an audience with the king. He has an official letter from the Pope. Right? We mentioned Herzl. This person's successful. This Proto-Zionist, this Herzl before Herzl, has convinced the Pope to give him some funding and to send his entourage to meet King João. King João meets him. King João is very impressed, although he also has whispering consultants and Jews saying, this Jew is, he's not who he says he is. And King João is going to he's going to think for about a year what he's going to do. We're not going to get into all of the story. It's a fascinating story. Go read about it. What I want to emphasize is that Davida Reubeni is going from king to king to the key and powerful figures in Europe trying to convince them of one thing. Let's together wage war, Christians and Jews, against the Muslims. Not only is this combined diplomatic, political, and potentially military action towards instilling Jewish sovereignty, right? Think of Ben Gurion, think of Sokolov. This is another one of our first Zionists. Think Rav Kook, Messiah, part of the Messianic process. But not only that, one could argue that David Reubeni is playing out, word for word, to perfection, the Abravanelian Messianic play. Now, before we go back to David Reubeni's meeting with the king, because in a moment we're about to focus on the king's secretary, his legal advisor, Diego Pires, because he's going to become super important. I just want to sort of continue with David Reubeni. He's frustrated because he doesn't get what he wants, and he causes a lot of trouble, and there are Jews that cause trouble for him, and, you know, kings don't like when others act like kings. He's sent off roaming Europe. For a while he disappears. In the end, he's going to get to King Charles. He's going to try and convince everyone ultimately of the same idea. Let's wage war, let's do it. He doesn't succeed. But he tries really, really hard for several years. I want to now go back to that meeting. In that meeting, Diego Pires, who is, you know, a very bright advisor, secretary to King Zhao, he sees this Jew walk in with this banner, with this sign of sovereignty, and it changes his life. It is a life-changing moment. Now, we have David Reubeni's diary, and Diego Pires is also going to start writing his own diary, except it's a mystical diary. And by the way, all the story we're telling is, as Eshkoli has shown, and Verskin, it's interesting that we have historic proof backing all of these different versions. If we look at the different national archives and at the Vatican, it's fascinating. According to Reubeni's diary, the day after he meets King Zhao, Diego Pires comes into his room and says to him, wow, circumcise me. David Reubeni says, what are you, nuts? Can you please leave? Can you please, I'm in the middle of an important mission, please leave, right? We already know what David Reubeni thinks of Diego Pires. For Diego Pires, he's not interested. Diego Pires, we learn from his diary, called Chayat Kana, this mystical diary. He tells us, I circumcised myself. He was so taken by what had happened, he circumcised like Abraham. He circumcises himself. And that night, that very night, when he circumcises himself, we read in his diary the following. After I was affixed with the seal of my Creator, right, circumcised, dreadful visions unfolded before me. It was then commanded upon me to head to the Ottoman kingdom, wherein I was allowed to make public the reasons and address the things that were being said, opinions and questions and investigations of the Jewish people. I traversed with rejoicing in their camp, for Rabbi David, make no mistake, this is David Reubeni, swiftly dispatched me on a clandestine mission. This is the Mossad before the Mossad, for the cause, for Reubeni's mission. Which mission is that? Political, diplomatic, military campaigning, Christendom against Islam, reinstilling Jewish sovereignty, the Abravanelian Messianic active play, word for word. But now, truthfully, I shall present myself before the Maker of heavens and earth, for I neither speak nor journeyed according to flesh or blood, but I solely act in accordance with our Lord, our God. Diego Pires becomes Rabbi Shlomo Molkho. It's an enigma how within 2 years, figures like Rabbi Yosef Karo, who gives us the Shulchan Aruch, the codification of Jewish law in Tzfat, and Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz, who gives us Lecha Dodi, are going to be so taken and inspired by Shlomo Molkho. In fact, Yosef Karo will say, I want to die like he dies. We'll get to that in a moment. This guy is preaching sermons after sermons in Saloniki, in Jerusalem, back in Rome, and everyone wants to be part of the show. Everyone wants to hear the Molkho show, the speeches and sermons, the drashas, whether you're Christian, whether you're Jewish. And guess what? Even though the Inquisition's after him, because he prophesizes floods and earthquakes and fallings of comets, everyone's protecting him, the Pope, and he's untouchable. And what's interesting is, what begins as a mission instigated by Davide Reubeni has in fact created a sort of Messianic Frankenstein. Because as we're about to see, and as we read here, Diego Pires turned Shlomo Molkho is now acting not on the accordance of Davide Reubeni, but in accordance with his mystical visions he reaches from the Lord. And here we are going to see this tension between what Reubeni tries to do and what Molkho tries to do. So what does Molkho's Messiah look like? He writes on in his diary, I adorned myself when he goes back to Rome after being in the Middle East. I adorned myself the garments, restoring my somber expression. I bound garments of silk, soiled and crumpled, oil stained upon myself, veiled in darkness. I walked forsaken and devoid of esteem, like a man afflicted, known to suffer. I traversed the city streets, crossing the bridge over the river Tiber, near the fortress of the Pope, where the destitute and the sick dwell. I sat among them, suspended, struck by the divine hand for 30 days. This is fascinating. In the Talmud, we have to have now Talmudic brackets. In the Talmud, part of this, multifaceted Messianic idea, we're told a story where one day Rabbi Joshua, son of Levi, comes to Elijah and says to him, when's Messiah coming? And he says to him, go ask him yourself. And he says, where do I find him? And Elijah says to him, he's sitting in that city, aka Rashi tells us Rome, right, where Christendom is, and he's sitting amongst the lepers and the sick, and we're not going to get into that story, but the point is, Shlomo Molkho is acting word for word, or reenacting, the Talmudic signs of Messiah, son of Joseph. And here, one could argue, this is coming very, very close to breaking rule number one of Jewish Messianism 101 of don't say you're Messiah. He doesn't say it. But we're treading on very, very thin ice. And we already see here an element, unlike the Abravanelian, unlike the Maimonidean King Messiah, that is powerful, a military chief of staff like Bar Kokhba. Here we have reference to one of the two depictions of Isaiah's Messiah. Isaiah 52-53, what has come to be known as the suffering Messiah. This is not an invention of Christianity, but this appears in Isaiah. This is this Messiah that suffers, that no one listens to, that is ashamed, no one listens to. In the time of redemption, the holy blessed be he will forgive, right? What is the purpose of this suffering Messiah? What does he look like? What's on his CV? Will forgive the sins of humanity in the merit of the Redeemer. The purpose of Messiah, son of Joseph, the active process, is like the calf on Yom Kippur. It's to take upon his shoulders the burdens, the sins of the Jewish people. Because someone's got to give, and purification has to happen if we want to reach the happily ever after. At that moment, the souls will shine with the light of life, pure and untainted by the damage they incur in association with the corporal body. The spirit and soul symbolizing the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Notice the Kabbalistic undertones. Let the souls astray from the righteous paths. Only when all the souls are restored to completeness, pure and embellished, and the spirit and soul are purified, will the arrival of Messiah, son of David, be delayed no longer. Do not entertain the notion that because we have spoken of him as described in human terms, he is akin to us in any earthly nature. Here Molkho is going to make a distinction, like Abravanel, between Messiah, son of Joseph, and Messiah, son of David. Yes, Messiah, son of Joseph, has a slightly different role. It's different to Davide Reubeni. It is the suffering Messiah. It is the Rabbi Joshua ben Levi that has to go to the gates of Rome sitting amongst the sick. It is inspired by, from the people who brought you, Isaiah 52-53, going and sitting amongst the suffering. It is seeing social justice and the weakest links of society. That's where Messiah rises from, this sort of unexpected David Copperfield. This is why, by the way, Messiah, son of Joseph, at times is called Messiah, son of Ephraim. And Molkho will address this. Because unlike Joseph, Ephraim is born to, he has a Jewish father, but an Egyptian sort of evil mother. And this is to say that Messiah is going to come from the least expected place. It's not going to be a yeshiva bucha. It's not going to be a chief rabbi. It's not going to be this sort of Maimonidean King Messiah. It's going to be this David Copperfield coming from the least expected place. It's going to be a Marano. It's going to be a Jew that was forced to be Christian. This is treading on very, very thin ice. And yet, having said that, this Messiah, son of Joseph, is real and natural. Even though he takes upon himself to redeem the Jewish people, he will die. He will die potentially in the same war. In fact, it is in the same war that Abravanel talks about, going to Yemen. Not the Yemen today and the Houthis, but connected to this Gog and Magog, this war between Christendom and Islam. This Redeemer will die, like Bar Kokhba. And this will lead to Messiah, son of David. And now the question that begs itself is, how does someone like Shlomo Molkho view history? What were the moments? Why is it that someone like him, when David Reubeni comes into King's Court, for him it's not just an event. It's got God's fingerprints all over it. And by the way, in brackets, one could argue, and there are those that argue, it's difficult to think that Molkho within 2 years became one of the most learned Kabbalists and Talmudists. It could be, but it could also be he was studying in secret. And so he was preparing himself for that moment that when David Reubeni walks in, he's like, this is the magic moment. This is a window of opportunity. So let's see what this looks like. Let's try and understand this Kabbalistic mindset that we're talking about when we talk about Kabbalistic birth pangs that connect us between the Messianic idea and the Zionist idea. How does this play out? We're reading now a passage which is brought from one of those sermons that Molkho was giving at what comes to be published as Sefer HaMefuar. As the soul sustains and animates the body, so does the Holy One, blessed be He, sustain and uphold all the worlds. This is expressed in the verse, the living of the world, in the portion of Ekev in the Bible, in Deuteronomy. We learn that the Holy Lord, blessed be He, guides the worlds with His unique name, supreme name, both those above and those below. Now pay attention very carefully. From there until the end of the verse, you will find 12 letters. This is how a Kabbalist studies Bible. This is a Kabbalist teaching us how to read text. Don't just read the meaning. You need to be counting the numbers of letters. You need to be intimate with the text. You need to really be loving the text, and that's noticing every itty-bitty little detail. So there are 12 letters in this little important bit, indicating that through the holy name, He governs the skies, resembling the 12 names that govern 12 zodiac signs. This is again the Abravanelian Kabbalistic view of history, that what drives the astral plane is the Kabbalistic Godhead. And this is what drives Molkho to then see that when Reubeni comes in, he knows it's time. Something has to happen. And the signs do nothing save according to the word of their Creator. And you will find also a verse. Here he continues on to explain to us how to read text. And here we will conclude with something very important. If for Molkho, this Kabbalistic view of history is to say that history is God, history is the divine unfolding, then what's the map? What's our compass for our Messianic figure to know when to do what? The Bible. The Bible is the map. And here, for example, he will take certain verses and letters that don't make sense and say, you need to know why a certain letter is back to front and stooped, because it symbolizes the rise and fall and rise again of the Jewish people. And if you read the lettering inside here, in the famous text that we read when the Torah comes out, Vayhi bin so Aaron, you need to understand that this text is the map for the Kabbalist to know when to do what. And in this sense, for Shlomo Molkho, unlike David Reubeni, it is all a Kabbalistically inspired Messianic idea, albeit requiring an active process. And yet, if we look at David Reubeni and Shlomo Molkho together, both who in the end get to the ruler of the Roman Empire, King Charles V, and tragically, we're not sure what happens there. Some say Molkho tried to convince him to convert. Others say that the two tried, once they reunited, to continue with this plan of waging war, Jews, Christians against Muslims, Molkho's burned to the stake. And from the looks of it also, David Reubeni was, and it ends sourly. But eventually, ultimately, Jews didn't listen. Nothing came of these attempts that one could argue, if we think back to Ben Gurion, Sokolov, and Rav Kook, we have here what fits into each and every one of our molds, or in some of our molds, whether we take out Messianism, add in Messianism, but we are talking here about active steps, about Kabbalistically viewing history as the divine calling, saying, I need you to get up and do it, I need you to get up and fix it, and then a Messiah, son of Joseph, that is acting diplomatically, politically, militarily, Kabbalistically, albeit in different variations, to try and reinstill Jewish sovereignty. So that's it for today, and next week we are going to shift into the 17th century to Amsterdam and to New York to see the evolution of Messiah, son of Joseph. Until then, thank you very much.